In this video, we're going to be talking about measuring welfare. So in the last video, we ended it by talking about what welfare was and how it's equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So it's equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So in this video, we want to talk, this area, this huge triangle. In this video, we want to talk a little bit more about about welfare in general, and also what welfare means in a competitive market. So we see here that competition maximizes welfare. This is a big deal. This is a very important reason why we start with perfect competition in the first place, right? So it says competition maximizes welfare because price is equal to marginal cost at competitive equilibrium. In other words, if we were to draw this out, I try to draw big pictures, but I want to write some words. If we were to draw this out, our equilibrium point where supply is equal to demand, right? Here is our price. Now remember that our supply curve is our marginal cost curve. So in perfect competition, or in competition or competitive equilibrium, we see that price is equal to marginal cost. Competitive equilibrium. So let's say some words about why that's important. Well, at this point here, bear with me here. So at this point, let's call it point B. At point B, the output produced, and purchased is such that the consumer's value of the last unit, so of this unit that happens here, we'll call this Q star, of that 50th unit, of the last unit, so this was equal to 50, if unit of output is exactly equal to the amount that it costs to produce it. In other words, the minimum amount that the producer is going to accept for this good is exactly equal to the value that the consumers are willing and able to pay for this 50th unit. So the gain at this unit for the consumer is equal to the gain at this unit for the producer, right? We're in equilibrium instability here. What this also means is that because both the producer and the consumer are experiencing the same level of gain at this last unit, our welfare in the entire economy is maximized. Okay, so we say that competitive equilibrium allows for market output that is allocatively efficient. This is extremely important. It's efficient because what is produced is equal to what is sold. In fact, what people want to produce is equal to what wants to be, I'm going to change this from sold to purchased. Okay, allocatively efficient. Now we can say that there is allocative inefficiency when that output is no longer Q star. So when it's either greater than or less than Q star. Let's consider those two scenarios. First, we have if Q in the market is less than Q star. So let's see what that would look like. So we have our market space here. This is price, this is quantity. Again, this is the markets. And we have our demand curve. We have our supply curve. Remember, this is marginal cost. And from here, we can see that equilibrium, let's use red. Competitive equilibrium happens at this point. We can call this E1, equilibrium 1. And so this is P star. This is the price in the markets. It's the price that sets quantity demanded equal to quantity supplied. It's the price where at the quantity that is produced here, Q star, the gain to the producers and the gain to the consumer is equal for at this exact point. We're not saying that the triangles have to be equal, they don't. But at this point, consumer surplus is equal to producer surplus for this particular unit. In fact, they're both zero. There's no additional gain because this is exactly the minimum amount that has to be paid, right, for the producer of this unit. And this is exactly what this consumer is willing and able to pay. So there is no surplus there for the consumer or producer at that equilibrium output. Now we're looking at a scenario where Q is less than Q star. So if we have some Q here, let's call this Q1, that is less than Q star, right? So we start at 0. So we can trace this out to see what price in the markets will be. Now, because the quantity in this market is less than equilibrium, we see that the price is going to be higher in this market. So this is our new price. We'll call this P1 in the market. Okay, so we can draw out the areas. We can draw out consumer surplus. We can draw out producer surplus. We can draw out and thus draw out welfare. Excuse me, this should be purple. Welfare in this market. So let's do that. Now, remember, originally, I wonder if it's going to let me. What I'm going to do is shade in our original producer surplus, right? The difference between the minimum they want to accept for this Q in the market versus what they actually get. This is our original producer surplus. Right? And our original consumer surplus, okay, is the difference between what the consumers are willing and able to pay. Notice that I'm going all the way down to Q star here because we're in equilibrium. The Q that's happening in this market is equilibrium quantity. So it's what they're willing and able to pay up to the last consumer whose surplus is now 0 versus what they actually pay in the market. So this triangle here, this purple triangle, is our original consumer surplus. Now, we have that instead things are changing. So we're dealing with at Q1, therefore P1, no longer P star. So let's see what's going on. We said purple is for producer surplus. So producer surplus is the difference between what the minimum the producer will accept, and we're going all the way up to whatever it is they produce. Remember, this is the Q, this is the quantity that is now in this market, Q1, versus what they actually get in the market for this quantity, right? So we have this trapezoid shape for our producer surplus. So our producer surplus is now this entire area. We notice that it takes away some of the consumer surplus, right? And that makes sense because now the consumers are facing a higher cost and lower quantity, higher price and lower quantity. So this new shaded area is our producer surplus. Now, for the consumer, we're saying that it's the difference between for green, it's the difference between what they're willing and able to pay up to this quantity here in the market versus what they actually pay in this market. So now we're looking at the smaller green triangle. Okay, so if our consumer surplus is that green triangle, producer surplus is this purple trapezoid here, then we can say that our economic welfare, which is this color, is the sum of these. So, I need to sheet that in. This is consumer surplus. So we can see that our economic welfare is now this area. It's no longer that big pink versus big yellow. It's now this smaller area here. Consumer surplus versus producer surplus. So what's missing? We have this triangle here that used to belong to the consumer and the producer, but now goes to no one, right? Let's call this area here F, and we'll call this area here B. Now, what's special about area B and area F? Well, area F used to be gain for consumers with output of competitive equilibrium Q star, but now goes to no one. Okay, and B, you can do that same analysis, right? Used to be gain for producers with Q star, but now goes to no one with Q1. So what we're trying to say here is that the distance between Q1 and Q star, there is still this space where what the cost to producers of making this good, the distance between Q1 and Q star, is lower than what the consumers are willing to pay. So the consumers would have been better off if we were able to produce this Q star. In other words, they could still afford it, and the producers would be better off too because they would get this extra gain from it. So this F and B that would have existed in a world with perfect competition or with the competitive equilibrium no longer does so with a lower quantity. Okay? With the greater quantity, we can do this analysis as well. So we have PQ, demand, supply, equilibrium, right? So at equilibrium, we have P star, we have Q star. Now, note that this is our original. I think I used yellow for original producer surplus. Yep. And pink. Yeah. Purplish pink for our original consumer surplus. The reason we always start here is because, remember, this point is allocatively efficient. So anything that steps away from it isn't. In other words, we have lower welfare in the economy. So we want to see what it looks like when things are great, and then we'll work our way from there. So this is consumer surplus. Now, if we have a scenario where the economy, where Q in the economy is now Q2. At Q2, we are overproducing. Too much supply. Overproducing. So the price decreases in this market. Remember, in the last one, we didn't have enough, which caused price to increase. In this one, we have way too much, which has caused price to decrease. So let's see what happens in this economy due to this. Producer surplus, let's start with consumer. Consumer surplus is going to be the area between the price that the consumer is willing, price that the consumer is willing and able to pay. We're not going to stop here because, you know, they're getting all the way down here to this versus what they actually pay. Right? So we have this now big green triangle for the consumer. But what happens to the producer? How about the producer? Well, for the producer, their producer surplus is now going to be the distance between the minimum, and you ask yourself, well, this is actually the Q they want, right? So what happens here? Well, it stops right here. And the price that they actually receive. Because at this price that they receive, this is the Q that they would like to produce. However, because they're producing a Q that is much higher, they're suffering a loss. And this loss is going to show up as a net loss. Loss in the economy. Loss in the economy. Okay, so some of that loss was transferred as gain to the consumer. And we think, oh, well, that's fine. But we also have this area here that is transferred to no one. It's our net loss or our deadweight loss. I didn't mention that name up here. F and B are also equal to deadweight loss. Because there are things that would have existed but are now lost to us. This is a loss that is actually incurred, net loss. By producers in the economy. And why are we saying this? Why are we calling it a loss? Well, for goods between Q star and Q2, we see that the producer is making stuff that costs way more than what the consumer is willing and able to pay for it. So they're dealing with this net loss in the economy between Q star and Q2. So if, putting all this together, if we have a scenario, this is now producer surplus. Sorry, bear with me. I'm trying to hold many thoughts at once. This is now consumer surplus. Okay, so if we have a scenario where Q is not equal to Q star, as in competitive equilibrium, we will always have deadweight loss. Either excess suffering to producers, which they face as net loss, and the economy as a whole therefore faces this, suffers from this, or we have deadweight loss as something that would have existed for both a good thing that would have existed for both the consumer and producer that is now gone away. You could ask, what is the okay, I think that's a good place to stop for this. Good job watching this video. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email.